You got more people engaged in politics because they've been more affected in their daily lives than they have been before. And it wasn't about certain ideologies or certain practices. It was about what is affecting them. How much money are they taking home? How expensive is it to fill their gas tank? How expensive is it to buy their groceries? And these are hard problems to solve, but the status quo was unacceptable.
I'm real happy to say we are joined this week by the Alaska Commissioner of Revenue, Adam Crum, a conservative public health expert, former football player.
Yes, sir.
Heck, maybe you still play football, but you played football a lot at one point. And I will say we've just met in person. We're filming this on location in a great part of the American South. A very articulate guy. So all of you in the audience, you're going to love this guy if you don't yet know him. Thanks for being here, Adam.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor. Appreciate it.
You know, it's not often that we little people in the continental United States get to spend time with Alaskan big brothers.
You know, in the lower 40, in Alaska, we call this the lower 48.
Of course you do.
And we're the upper one.
Great state. You are truly a very important statewide official there. And we're going to talk about revenue. We're going to talk about conservative governance. We're going to talk about public health. But you've got a really interesting story, which I think a lot of Alaska natives do. And in every way, it really is sort of the quintessential American story. But I often, Adam, in these conversations, like to start with people's story because every American has a great story to tell. How did you get to do what you're doing?
Yeah, this is it's a very Alaskan story in the fact that it's about saying yes and, you know, stepping up. Can you help? Are you going to help your neighbors? Yeah. And I'm born and raised in Alaska. My dad was born in the territory of Alaska. His father was stationed there in the military. And I had the opportunity growing up, big family there's 5 kids. My dad got hurt at work, and so we actually had to sell our house in Homer, Alaska, and move to our dry cabin in Anchor Point of 2 bedrooms with 7 people. And so we didn't have running water for a couple of years. We had a portable boat porta potty, which was used inside only for most extreme circumstances, and the boys had to enjoy the outdoors. And grew up like that, but it was just wonderful times growing up in Alaska and fishing. But as we grew up, I had the opportunity to go to Northwestern to play football. Had that chance, and I came back, and I'm working at my family company and just working in industry across the board. And then I decided I want to do something with my science background. I had a psychology and pre-med degree. And so I went to Johns Hopkins, got a Master of Science in Public Health, and I'm working with industry and doing contracts with oil companies and Alaska Pipeline. And the governor, had put the bug in my head, and I put it forward. It was like, to go help him run the Department of Health and Social Services in Alaska. And in Alaska, that's the largest department by position and by budget. And I had just turned 34 when he had actually appointed me to that role. And it was a daunting task because a lot of factors actually popped up immediately. Our state psychiatric hospital actually was about to lose its licensure by the Joint Commission. And so we had to do drastic measures to keep that open. We worked through that first year. And then I do remember vividly, January 26th, 2020 at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, I got a phone call. I answered it, and it was the Administration of Children and Families. So I was like, oh, how are you doing? They said, Adam, we have a question to ask you. Would you allow U.S. citizens from Wuhan to come land in the state of Alaska? And excuse me? And it was the State Department employees that chartered a plane from Wuhan to fly back to Alaska, Washington, and California. They're having a hard time deciding if they could land or not, and they wanted a place to go. Quick call to the governor. He goes, absolutely, they're American citizens. And so we had to work over the next week to coordinate. This is January of 2020. We don't know what's going on. We don't know if a zombie plane is going to land. And we used this terminal that's not used in the wintertime in Alaska, and we prepped it, and they were able to land and be safe. And the cool stories were these people, they touched the ground, they just screamed joys like, we're in America, we're on the soil again. Because repatriation happened to be under my department. And it was just an interest. I didn't know repatriation was under my department.
Although if you pause and think about it, it does make sense.
It does make sense now. But that was early in my tenure, and I was like, "Why are you guys calling me?" And I have to do that job too.
What a story!
Yeah,
those Americans who landed in Alaska will never forget that moment.
Never forget it. They were talking about how they were scared the plane was going to leave without them, so they were running, dropping suitcases, trying to catch the plane. There was even a little girl who fell and broke her arm and had to get care on the flight. while they landed, and they had teddy bears and stuff available. We had all of the public health stuff in Alaska, working with the local fire departments and hospitals, and everybody just kind of came together to just take care of it in this moment. There was news crews from around the world not around the world, around the U.S., because there was no global travel at that point, lined up at the fence watching the plane touch down, like to see who was going to get off the plane.
So based on your practical experience leading public health in Alaska during COVID, as well as your expertise studying at, I think, the greatest program in the world in public health at Johns Hopkins, what are the lessons that everyday Americans should draw from COVID, both the disease itself, as well as perhaps even more so from this public policy guy, the public policy response, particularly at the federal level?
Yeah. I would say the first thing that all Americans need to take from this is we have to take responsibility for our own health, meaning that the greatest way to fight a respiratory virus is to go for a walk, to have a strong immune system, to make sure that you actually have a good VO2 max, to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves that way so we're never put in this position again. And I'd say the other thing that we have to do is to make sure that immediately, if there is a threat, we identify, is there a vulnerable population, and how do we protect that population while the rest of society can go on? And it just so happens that with COVID, the most vulnerable population was your senior population. Some of those with chronic illnesses, those over age 65, they had the highest mortality rate. In Alaska, we were very successful in getting through COVID. I think it was the second or third lowest mortality rate, because we focused our resources on our senior living centers, our assisted living, to make sure that those staff were taken care of, that they were protected. And the rest of Alaskans, we said, go outside. There was no stay at home. It was go outside. Alaska's big and beautiful. Go get space. You'll find 6 feet.
Quite easily in most parts of Alaska, right? So from there, leading public health in Alaska, you moved on to what seems to be totally disconnected, but it's not, and that is leading the Department of Revenue for Alaska. Tell us about the differences between those jobs, but also about the overlap in duties, at least indirectly.
Yeah, what kind of led to this was we're going through COVID, we're doing well as a state. And the governor had asked, look, what is the best structure of the health department? It is massive. It's disparate. There was 9 separate divisions. I have a very small executive team to manage 3,500 employees and over 4,000 during COVID. And so we put forward a plan using an executive order via the governor to actually split the department in two, which sounds counterintuitive to a small government conservative, but we were failing to provide services adequately, and we were wasting resources that way. And knowing intuitively that we can actually put together a better structure for better transparency and better problem solving. And the ultimate goal is to serve people. And so we were able to do this. And in 2022, we were able to split Department of Health and Social Services into the Department of Health, which has Medicaid and the public health program, and into the Department of Family and Community Services on the other side, which has child welfare, juvenile justice, and your assisted living homes. And so what that's been able to do was it kind of put a magnified, right? We use the great disinfectant of salt and light to make sure what are the internal problems, not to affect the current services that are provided to Alaskans, but to do that. And that was a big lift. After COVID, after getting that done, I was ready to step aside. And it was very clear that our governor was going to, run to re-election. And it just so happened that the Department of Revenue role came open. And we had conversations about, would I move over and step into this? He wanted to make sure that he had a commissioner that hit the ground running, that was known to the public. And I was like, after 4 years of health, this sounds a little bit refreshing. And it's a change. It's a brain switch. You're moving from tactical, dealing with fire after fire and vulnerable populations that you want to serve in the best way possible. And it's just impossible to give the greatest level of service, and it wears on you. And for everybody who works in that field, my heart goes out to you. You're doing the Lord's work. And then moving into the financial side, which is sitting on boards and investing and looking at long-term strategies, it's this strategic mindset. And the first thing is, I had a friend warn me, and it was so true. In the first 2 weeks, I noticed I had developed a nervous tic of checking my email. Like every 30 seconds. I was so used to something going wrong that I had to check my email. But it turns out, when you go from, 3,500 to like 400 employees, you don't get that many emails anymore. It really does drastically change. And so that was a big mindset, but it's been a pretty fantastic change.
So Adam Crum's first rule on the rule of healthy living is don't check your email every 30 seconds.
Yeah. I had some very stern talks by my wife about my phone addiction, about being able to put it away. and to leave it aside and not use the screen and to actually, so I've forced myself to go on walks without headphones, without trying to do the model of efficiency of listening to a podcast as you go. It's just actually give your brain time to think.
Well, this will sound like a digression to some, but I think you'll appreciate it. In the state of the lower 48, probably most like Alaska, and that's Wyoming, where I spent a few years, president of Wyoming Catholic College, we disallowed students from having cell phones. And we did that because as a great book school, seminar-based, we wanted the students not just, we would say, immersed in their books. That was partially true. We wanted them immersed in human conversation. And we wanted them immersed in what we called God's first book, the outdoors, nature. I mean, Alaskans in particular appreciate that. And we had, and the college still has, this wonderful outdoor leadership program. Cell phones would have gotten in the way of that. And the point that I'm driving at is to the point that your wife was making to you, is that when we would have guests come on campus, particularly if they were from out of state and from the East Coast, they would spend time with the students. They'd come have lunch with them. They'd sit in on classes, and they would come by at the end of the day and they would say, Kevin, I've never been around young Americans more personable, more cheerful. And they said, where do you find these kids? I said, they're just like anyone else's kids, but when you take those cell phones away, they become real people again.
That's amazing. I bet you, did you ever quantify and measure your levels of anxiety and depression that are diagnosed on campus?
And anecdotally, and it's remarkable. In fact, on weekends when the students would be able to check out some outdoor equipment and go take advantage of the outdoors, for safety purposes, of course, we let them have their cell phones. And their anxiety for some of them coming back from those weekends, which when it should have been lower was actually higher because maybe they had some phone calls or some text messages or whatever, and a lot of times when they would come back from their home visits over Christmas break or summer, the young men in particular were very anxious to give us their phones back. Like they were looking forward to that retreat, if you will, that respite from the phones. Technology can be helpful. But also, sort of rule number 2, as I remind my heritage colleagues every day, or every all staff meeting, go touch some grass.
Yeah.
It's really important to spend some time outdoors.
It really is. This morning I woke up, coming to the East Coast, it's a 4-hour time change. And so I always force myself to wake up before the sunrise. And I went out to the beach and I walked barefoot on the sand to get some of that blue light coming in. So I like Andrew Huberman. So the importance of sunlight.
You're living the dream.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the importance of revenue.
Yeah.
And the importance of your job in Alaska. And I think, even though, of course, audience members are perfectly smart people, unless they are from Alaska or they've spent some time studying it, they don't appreciate 2 things in particular. First is just the scope and scale of natural resources and the value of those assets for the Alaskan people. And secondly, how difficult a job that could be to manage if someone has the wrong idea.
Yeah. Absolutely. So Alaska is a resource state. We were created as such by the Statehood Act in 1959. And so in order to do that, the federal government was wary of Alaska becoming a state because they didn't want to another ward of the federal government. And so in order to actually avoid that, it was set up that all of the state resources were collectivized underneath the government, meaning that mineral rights, water rights all belong to the state as opposed to an individual, and that would be used to help fund government. And then shortly thereafter, in the 60s, they discovered the massive fields of Prudhoe Bay. And from there, it has funded our state government for the majority. Up until recent times, about 5-6 years ago, the sovereign wealth fund that we have, the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, which was created in 1976, some very wise Alaskans look to see how do we take a non-renewable resource in our minerals and turn it into a renewable resource to provide intergenerational equity. And they turned this and they invested it. And over time, we now have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the United States at $82 billion. And there's a rule that the legislature put in place. They do a 5% annual percent of market value draw. And it's the first 5 of the last 6 years, meaning that there's a smoothing effect. So we're able to anticipate at the start of one fiscal year what the next year's fiscal draw is going to be. So it provides time for planning and liquidity purposes. But that amount now is 55% of our unrestricted general funds in government. And so we have turned ourselves into an almost endowment-like state to where we'll provide that. And we don't pay, as a citizen, you don't pay state sales, you don't pay a state income tax, and you don't pay a state property tax. The only one in the country.
So what are the challenges in managing that, whether challenges unique to Alaska government and politics, because every state has those. Yeah. Or, as I presume in recent years has been even bigger challenge, external challenges, say from the ESG, environmental social governance.
Yeah,
approach.
one of the greatest things on that is the balance of the state budget is paid for by minerals, by resources, which is fishing, which is timber, 37% of which is oil and gas. And from that, 25% of all mineral royalties are deposited into the Permanent Fund Corp. And so we actually still rely on this. And so we produce about 500,000 barrels a day from a peak of 2 million, which was in the late 80s. So this 500,000 barrels a day, though, we have stemmed this decline over the last decade. It has held flat and steady, so much so that ConocoPhillips refers to it as a slow declining basin. So it's different than the capital treadmill, so to speak, of a shale play. You dump a lot of money, you get your oil, and you're done. But these things have lasted for 40, 50 years. So the hard part is, how do we actively develop the resources we know are still there? So ConocoPhillips has this field that they're working on in the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska. Get that. It's called National Petroleum Reserve. It's owned by the federal government, and the outgoing administration, how good is that to say? The outgoing administration is actively locking up that acreage of the National Petroleum Reserve for development. That's one of our giant pain points in Alaska, is how are you actually restricting us from doing what you promised us when we became a state? And so this field, though, this Willow field, will come online. It'll be 180,000 barrels a day at peak production. It's going to come online in 2029. There's another field that Santos is doing, which is about 80,000 barrels a day. And hopefully we're having that at the start of this next year in 26. And so we've got a lot of benefits there, but those are kind of the only ones on the horizon because we have been limited. 60% of the land in the state of Alaska is owned by the federal government. And here's the crazy kicker. We were promised a number of acreage as a state when we were made a state. The federal government still owes us 4.9 million acres. Still. And
what's the status of that?
Don't know. And that's what we're hoping. President Trump, outside of when we were initially bought, has been the greatest president for the state of Alaska. He is a huge friend. He stops there a lot because he travels to Asia, and he'll stop and he'll make time to meet with Alaskans. And so we're hoping that we can kind of get this done, and over with, to make sure that we are covered on this, and that our ability to develop roads, which have been set in Congress under the ANILCA Act, which is the roads to resources. Currently, the most westerly highway point in North America is in the middle of the state. We don't go west of the middle of the state. There's no roads. It's just north and south. And so even though Congress had an intention 40 years ago for us to build roads to resources, we are precluded to from federal agencies.
So are you all going to be happy when Canada becomes the 51st state?
I don't know. Maybe.
It sort of diminishes the Alaskan mystique.
It does a little bit. Canada's very good at some things. Most of the world's largest mining companies are Canadian. So they do a lot of good things.
It's a short list.
Yeah.
What about Greenland? I mean, that would really challenge Alaska for uniqueness.
It absolutely would. I haven't looked at the demographics of Greenland, nor the population, but
it's a whopping 56,000 people.
Wow. Yeah, we're way bigger than they are.
You're what, 12 times bigger?
Yeah, at least. We're 733,000 people.
That's right. So people, I was going to say, back to serious banter. Actually, there's some seriousness to at least to the Greenland thing, and with real legitimacy. People don't realize, I didn't realize this until we moved to Wyoming, the negative impact of the federal government owning such a large percentage of land. So Americans east of the Continental Divide, certainly east of the Mississippi River, basically have no reason to have any concept about why this is so, how it's so, the impact that it has. I think about the first time that I went to Teton County, where Jackson Hole is in Wyoming. 97% of the land is owned by the federal government. It's of course, it's the reason that housing is so expensive along with demand, but it's also one of the reasons it's governed poorly because it has an effect on politics. Walk us through, people living particularly on the East Coast, about why this is such a problem.
Yeah, the difference is, so if you're a hunter or an outdoorsman on the East Coast, you will go hunting for deer. It's on private land. You've got people that will have shares. They'll have they'll share with friends. If you're in a Western state, you go hunting on public land. And sometimes it's state-owned, sometimes it's federal-owned. And that means you're actually governing two different regulatory bodies. Sometimes it's your state fish and game service versus your federal park service, so Fish and Wildlife. And so those are big issues in and of itself. The fact that Western states typically, and I think Utah is the only state that beats Alaska. I think Utah's like 62% federally owned. Western states are primarily federally owned, like massive portions of this. Why is the Department of Interior based, our ruling company, so to speak, based in DC, so far away from the people that it's in charge of managing? There is no land the Department of Interior manages on that side of the country. It should be over on the western half. That's one big issue, closer to the people you govern. On top of that, the rules that the federal government implies is the overextension. The NEPA Act was never intended to actually be the deciding document for whether or not resource development occurs. It was actually created to be an informational or informing document on policy decisions. And now the NEPA process is extensive, and it's thousands of pages of a NEPA document that has to be done and completed before you can actually even come to a record of decision. And that was never the intent. And this is something that we hope with the Chevron deference that we either have congressional action to really make that firm and clear that you shall do this to agencies, or that we get the right people within agencies who actually follow the mission. Believe it or not, the Bureau of Land Management has a incredible mission as to develop and help move America's resources. But they are seen as one of the greatest blockers of any and all development.
Going back to the assets, thanks for the explanation. Going back to the assets that are under your, not control, but guidance, you have to make some decisions on investing those. Mm-hmm. And although Alaska has but 733,000 people, all of them great Americans, it carries a lot of weight when it comes to investing because of those assets. Tell us about some of the episodes you've had with Eastern capital markets that have to listen to you perhaps more than they would like.
Yeah. Being an $82 billion fund is anytime we move so I sit as a trustee on that board, but if we adjust our asset allocation even by 1 or 2%, that's billions of dollars. And that affects the markets greatly at the timing upon which that capital is deployed. And so we have a number of groups that will actually follow us from around the world as to what are you doing? What is your new thing? You know, and we are broken out. Our alternatives is vast. We're into private income, private credit, you name it, infrastructure. It's all across the board. And it's a very sophisticated portfolio that we have. From a risk standpoint, it's somewhere between a collegiate endowment versus a public pension fund. So it's a little bit more risk than a public pension. It's actually really hard to quantify. We try to do this on a regular basis, working with industry groups in order to set staff compensation. But the conversations we have with these groups is how do we actually move our money around, but how do we do it in such a way that actually respects Alaska? We have it in statute for both our $50 billion defunct retirement management board, as well as the Permanent Fund Corporation, that the goal of the trustees is to maximize risk-adjusted returns. And so that is actually the best fiduciary cover that you can ever have. You don't want to say you're forced to divest from certain areas. You want to see you're actually doing a market analysis and moving forward. But when you look at this, we have to take into account our actions on what it is for the state economy. Because again, 25% of all mineral resources are deposited into the corpus of the permanent fund. So if we are in some way investing or allowing proxy votes to actually go against resource development in Alaska, that is in turn hurting our bottom line. You may get investment return on one end, but you're depleting, actually replenishing the corpus on the other.
What to dial back from the focus on Alaska and talk about something I know you spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the future of America, the future of self-governance in America. Mm-hmm. Whether that's from a public policy standpoint or sort of individual behavior standpoint. What lessons do you think Americans who've never been to Alaska could draw from Alaska, speaking to them American to American?
Yeah. Alaska is a beautiful place. Alaska is a very harsh place. And, there's a lot of internal debate of how long do you have to be there? What makes you an Alaskan? But there's a pretty general consensus that if you can live through an Alaskan winter, then you're an Alaskan. And it depends on the area of the state. It's not necessarily cold. The weather is just schizophrenic and it's long. And, I'll share this. And I've grown up in Alaska. As a kid, you only ever left during the wintertime, like Christmas, or in the summer. You don't leave during the shoulder season. And it wasn't until my very first fall in Chicago that I actually realized September was a warm month. And it really threw me off because I'm used to having frost on the ground in mid-September. And you realize, oh, like the seasons aren't as long there. But in Alaska, Alaskans are independent. A lot of people are up there for a reason. They wanted adventure, but then they actually appreciate the community that they have. I think it's less than 45% or something like that of Alaskans are registered to a party. Alaskans are independent. They want their own thought. We typically go statewide. We vote red, but on a localized basis, it really depends on the candidate. And so one thing that really annoys all Alaskans of all stripes is we are not a monolith. Every region is different. Every region has a different industry that they appreciate, something that they focus on. And we do not want to be your museum. And that is one thing we far too often get seen as is stay clean, don't develop, don't do anything, stay there so I can come in with my rich buddies and hunt and fish. And that really bugs us because we're there and we go hunting and fishing to fill our freezers. And that's what I do. The first food my daughters ate was a silver salmon that I caught. And we did that the day each of them turned 6 months old. That was the first food we wanted them to eat. And it was important for us to know where the food comes from, where they see that.
And that really dovetails rather beautifully, dare I say providentially, with the Make America Healthy Again movement. where we get our food, right?
100%. Honestly, the Governor Dunleavy did a really good job putting a focus on.
He's so great, by the way.
He's a really good visionary. He looks long term and how you move stuff along, and protecting Alaska's food security. I was in the room with him during COVID when we had a call with the governor of Washington, who said he's thinking about shutting down the Seattle port. And at that point in time, that is where, I don't even know the number, it's a mass percentage of Alaska's food comes from, is departs from the port. And it was everything across the board. Like, I will send down our National Guard. We will staff it. We will do anything possible. You cannot do this. But it was just realizing our vulnerability in that time. And since then, he has been able to move things along. We have herd shares now. So my wife really jumped on that. She's a conservative hippie, that you buy a herd share so you get access to raw milk. So we do raw milk. We buy eggs from our neighbor. We have our berry colored sprinkles, not food dye colors. So Callie means to appreciate that one. And so there's a lot of things like this it's the health movement. But in Alaska, you'll find a lot of people that are trying to do it their own way. It's this weird thing in the fact that we have a short summer but long days. We can actually have extensive vegetable crops that are returned, but you then have to find a way to store them. So then it's a lot of pickling or like root cellar storage and things like that. But there's a lot of Alaskans. It's a pretty robust cottage industry from the farm side.
A couple of final questions, sort of piggybacking on this great Alaskan thread, Adam. What do you make of the most recent presidential election? And by that, I mean, take that however you would like, of course. But I don't even mean that so much so specific to President Trump, although that's fine. And we're grateful, as much as does it say something about the American spirit, which for centuries was so much tied to this independence that came from a frontier that you know better than anybody. And in the growing absence of that kind of frontier for most Americans, can we draw a long-term lesson from this short-term victory?
Yeah. The amazing thing was when you look at it, I think the comment was made that it's like 120,000 votes separated the Electoral College. But the big change in the culture that I look towards was the popular vote. And the popular vote and who voted and who came out was a very big change that we have to look at. You got more people engaged in politics because they've been more affected in their daily lives than they have been before. And it wasn't about certain ideologies or certain practices. It was about what is affecting them. How much money are they taking home? How expensive is it to fill their gas tank? How expensive is it to buy their groceries? And these are hard problems to solve, but the status quo was unacceptable. And as we go forward, when we look at this, I think we do have to take a frontier mindset. And we look at Alaska, which still has incredible amounts of oil reserves. China, as an example, is one of the world's largest producers of antimony, which is a critical component, not just in high-tech industry, but also for our munitions and our strategic defense. Well, they're no longer going to export to the United States, and we have less than 2 years of storage. The last mass development of antimony was in Alaska. But is the federal government going to allow us to build a road to resources to hit our antimony deposits so we can protect ourselves as a country, as we actually stand up and do peace through force, peace through strength around the rest of the world? I mean, these are things like this that we really need to answer. And I think a lot of people realize we have got to find a way to take advantage of just our natural benefits. We are a country that sits on two oceans. We have incredible diversity, both in our population, in our weather, as well as the resources that we do have. We can be self-contained. If we were isolated from the rest of the world, we would thrive. But that's not healthy for everybody. That's not the mindset that we have. That's not the Christian generosity that we all share. How do we go and take care of others? How do we actually make sure that we are that example that is developing the technology and the resources that we can export out, take care of ourselves, and then export out to actually prop up others? And I think that's the mindset we have right now. People want to have the dignity of work. They want to have the ability to own a home, to take care of their family, to keep to themselves, and just provide. And it's really weird having a conversation saying that that's a revolutionary idea, because that's just how we function in our daily lives. And we need this ability to get back to that.
So what do you tell younger Americans? By then I'm thinking high school, college, just out of college aged Americans who might have a little more spring in their step after the election, but who are, based on their experience with the American dream, more skeptical than you and I were when we were their ages. It's a version of the last question I often ask guests, which is always sort of grasping for some hopefulness, but not in any hollow way. I wouldn't ask an Alaskan to do that. But really, for a generation you no doubt know well, what advice do you give them to participate in rebuilding an America where they can say one day that the American dream is real?
Yeah. The ladder of success is well defined. Controlling for socioeconomic status, ethnic status, even locations of where you came from. It is known that if you get a high school diploma, if you then get married, then you have a job, get married, then have kids, that is the pathway to success. Notice I didn't say college, because at this point in time, the value of college has been greatly diminished. And I have 2 very good degrees, and I'll be the first one to tell you, college is probably not for everyone, and it's probably not necessary only in very specific pathways, because you can make such a very good living being skilled with your hands. And I would say that the pathway of success is very clearly defined. The ability to have grit is one of the greatest determining factors of success. And that is the ability to withstand. It's to work. It's to understand. You can actually move forward. You can pick a skill set. You can thrive in that field. You can expand. You can learn through very different means and then go to a different career as necessary. But you have to try. And far too many Americans and young kids I see with these screens are just involved in that as opposed to the community. And from a health standpoint, get a community, get your village. These are your family. These are your friends. Stay next to, talk to people. And you'll find levels of depression will start falling off the more active you are and the more you work and the more you realize the dignity of work. And from that's how we have a healthy, thriving, vibrant country and communities. And we have to start low. We have to, when I say low, I mean local. You got to do it at the low end and take care of your families next door. And the problems will actually the solutions and the good will start bubbling up from there.
Yeah. And what probably surprises people is in a place like Alaska, particularly Alaska, as you said, where there can be this frontier spirit and this independence, sort of this individualist spirit, that all of those things don't stand in contrast to another thing that's profound about Alaska that I have seen, and that is the strength of community. Yeah. And that's that combination of those things, the American independence and the leaning on community, like human community, not screen community, might be the single greatest thing that's missing.
I would say so. I was using an example in this earlier conversation. One of the best examples I have of like the modern world meeting the traditional world is the North Slope Borough of Alaska. It's this area across the state. They came together it's mainly Inupiaq Eskimos. And what they actually do is they realized that we have the ability here to actually have self-governance. And so they created a home rule borough, and they found a way to tax the oil and gas companies. And so there's no state property tax. There is a property tax on oil and gas assessments, which goes to the locals. Well, this borough, about 10,000 people, has like a $300 to $400 million annual budget, and they provide for their citizens. They have natural gas. They have a lot of resources that they provide for, and you still see a thriving community that still has the traditional whaling season of the bowhead whale. They still have their Naluckatucks, which is a beautiful ceremony where they pass out all of the shares. They get the whale, and they still share with the community, and they do the celebration honoring the whale. It's a glorious thing to watch, to see this. And, okay, they hunt caribou. They may do it off a snow machine. That's how it's changed, but they still live their traditional lifestyle. And the time frame upon which they actually started doing this, it has been documented. They have almost doubled their lifespan.
That's remarkable.
It is remarkable. And they are in control. They take care of it. And it's a wonderful place to visit because you still see the traditional with the modern. And they're living in a place that most would think that's the harshest place in the world. But there is a subtle beauty to it that they have learned to adapt to over thousands of years.
Well, I look forward to seeing that one.
Yeah.
So, and on that point, we'll wrap up this conversation for now. But one of the things we're planning to do with this show in the coming months and years, and my colleagues behind the camera don't even know this yet, is to go on location. So how about it? Deal. Okay. Adam Crum, I hope more Americans get to know your story and know you, although we want you, of course, to remain very happy in Alaska. Thanks for being such a cheerful, eloquent witness for truth and for America.
Thank you.
It's true. People who live in Alaska are great. I have not had that violated a single time. And Adam Crum, the revenue commissioner there, public health expert, and as you can tell over the last 45 minutes, very eloquent person about the American dream, has provided a real treat today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again, Adam. And for all of you, whether you're in Alaska or elsewhere, the American dream is still alive. Take care.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph von Spakovsky. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.